Good evening. Oh good, it's on. Good evening and welcome everyone. So glad that you're able to join us. My name is Andrew Westover. I'm the Eleanor MacDonald Storza Director of Learning and Civic Engagement here at the High Museum of Art. This program is in conjunction with our current exhibition, Kelli Connell, Pictures for Charis, which was organized by this museum, the Arizona Board of Regents on behalf of the University of Arizona Center for Creative Photography, and the Cleveland Museum of Art in Cleveland. The exhibition is currently on view and will close on January 5th. So if you haven't already, you must see the exhibition before then. At the end of this conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. You'll be able to submit your questions using the QR code on the screen. So, participation moment, if you could take out your phone at this time, go ahead and point it at this QR code. It's going to pull up a little web page, and on that web page at any point during the conversation, you can type in the question that you want to ask. Let's see. Let's now thank some of our generous supporters. This exhibition is made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines Incorporated, Mr. Joseph H. Bolin Jr., Harry Norman Realtors, with the Wish Foundation, and benefactor exhibition series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. I also want to thank our collaborators on this program, UGA's Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts and UGA's Lamar Dodd School of Art. And of course, thanks to the full High Museum team for their essential support making this program happen. And obviously, thanks to all of you. We hope that you enjoy this evening, and you've seen their bios online and on the screen, so I won't reiterate them now, but I'll simply say that we are honored and excited to hear from two luminaries this evening, artist Kelli Connell, curator Gregory Harris. Please join me in welcoming Kelli and Greg to the stage.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. As Andrew mentioned, we're going to be talking about our current exhibition, which is Kelli's latest body of work. It's on view in the lower level photography galleries until January 5th. I hope you've all had a chance to see it. We're going to talk about the installation of the exhibition at some point. So if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. You'll just have to imagine as best you can how the show looks. But it's a really fantastic body of work. It weaves together a lot of different threads, which makes it seem much more complicated than it actually is as you move through it. But it's sometimes kind of challenging to lay out all of the different parts of this body of work, because Kelli's trying to do a lot of different things with these pictures and with the words that go along with it. But it's a love story, it's kind of a revisionist history, it's a travel log, it's many, many different things. So we're gonna start with a reading. Kelli's gonna read from the book here, and then we're gonna dive into some of the questions that I've prepared for Kelli.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thank you everyone here for spending the evening with us. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to see the show completely installed tomorrow myself. I thought I would read a passage from the book, Pictures for Charis, and this book includes 80 of my photographs and 20 of Edward Weston's images. It also includes a long text that I've written and interweaves Charis Wilson's voice within that text, so it's a way for me to also include her voice by reading a little bit to you tonight. So this is from page 18. I look through my sketchbook and read my notes as Betsy takes a turn behind the wheel. In the months preceding this trip, I had scoured articles by critics, curators, and photographers for details about Charis. I traveled to the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson to sift through Charis and Edward's separate archives. I read their personal letters to one another, to family and friends. I carefully touched the memorabilia that had once belonged to them. I held each of the figurines Edward had given to Charis in the palm of my hand. I picked up a shawl Edward had given to Charis from one of his trips to Mexico and tenderly ran my fingers across the intricately woven pattern and fringe at its edges. Charis would not have written a memoir at all if it were not for her gnawing frustration with how narrowly Edward and his work were interpreted in the decades after his death in 1958. She had carefully cut out the articles that had so aggravated her, annotating the margins with passionate exclamation points, question marks, and X's, underlining the text often in red, sometimes twice. Later in her life, Charis was increasingly invited to give lectures on Edward and her time with him. In her notes for one of these engagements, she outlines her initial response to the invitation to speak. So this is Charis's voice now. No, of course not. 1, I'm not a speaker. 2, I'm not a photographer. 3, I'm not an expert. 4, I don't have theories about photography. 5, I don't even have slides. Then I thought of some yes buts. 1, haven't you been complaining in recent years that Edward's image was getting more and more unrecognizable? 2, shouldn't you try to correct some of this growing mythology before it gets any further out of hand? 3, why leave it to people who never knew him to furnish fanciful accounts of what they assumed he was like? 4, why indeed? Sifting through her papers, I found notes for another such talk. This is her voice again. Most of what is written and said about him leaves me somewhere between mildly amused and violently outraged. I know that I overreact and that the work of history is simplification. We collapse centuries into the dark ages and gloss over years and decades as the Roaring Twenties or the Depression. And as history gets simplified, so must individual lives. All the sharp, significant incidents that we've lived through and been shaped by eventually settle into a soft, generalized image, as if what was once a dazzlingly sharp photograph full of fine detail faded to a thoroughly pictorial mist with barely a discernible subject. This simplification process is at work today, transforming the real EW into an imaginary historical character, and there is no stopping it. I'm aware that it isn't possible to set the record straight. I hope, however, to produce a memoir in the coming year that will stem a little of the tide of nonsense that has been pouring E's way ever since big money and the photo market made him an easy target for the game of revelations. This is my voice now. How hard it must be to see someone so important to you, with whom you spent a significant part of your life, reduced in a few paragraphs to a person you don't recognize. When we lose people close to us, we become aware of the utter failure of language to describe the reality of who they were. And we realize the ways in which the stories people tell have the ability to reshape our understandings. And if the person is as well known as Edward Weston, their lives and art can readily be interpreted, used by other people to advance their own narratives, their own agendas. Unlike a photograph, a life is not immutable once the person who lived it has died. The life is remade by those who remain, Charis writes. In article after article, I watched the man I love being transformed into someone I could have never loved. This flesh and blood man was becoming a cliche-ridden myth created by people who never knew him. But photographs, too, create myths, shape perceptions. They allude to company kept. They portray a choice of dress, a mannerism in one brief instance. They offer clues, but they, like words, fail to deliver the embodied essence of someone, what it was like to be in their presence, to meet their eye, smell their scent, feel the warmth of their body in an embrace. They are distilled in an image and transferred to a piece of paper, a static likeness, a still photograph, a shadow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you read that, because that sets out so much of what you're trying to do, or kind of the context, the background for what you're trying to do. So to start, who was Charis? I think a lot of people have seen pictures of her but have no idea who she is. So who was she, and what drew you to make a body of work about her?
Yeah, so Charis Wilson, most of you who are familiar with the history of photography might have seen images of her without knowing who she really was. So she was a model for Edward Weston, and also his partner and companion for 11 years. They eventually married as well within that 11 years. But she was also a writer, and her dad, H.L. Wilson, was a very famous writer at the time in Carmel. Her grandmother and great aunt were also well-known writers in the Carmel art scene. And then her mother, I think I put a picture of her mother in this slideshow when it gets to that. Helen Wilson was a muse to a few other photographers and poets and painters in the Carmel community as well. Arnold Gint photographed her in 1908 in one of the pictures that you'll see here. So she grew up around a community of musicians, poets, painters, photographers, and she herself really wanted to become a writer. She received a scholarship to go to Sarah Lawrence College, and it was the Depression. It was really hard times. Her dad was having some financial difficulties, so they couldn't let her go to college. So in a way, Charis meeting Edward and being able to be around all these other artists that she met, and to go on this major trip with him for the Guggenheim travels. He was the first photographer who received a Guggenheim fellowship. It allowed her the opportunity to write. So she kept an extensive travel log during that time, and then she also was able to work on some articles for Cameracraft magazine that are credited to Edward Weston, but really she wrote them through interviewing him. And she also wrote under a pen name, F.H. Holiday, so she could write about the two of them in third person. And then after Edward passed away, she remarried, had two girls, and then was a mom and also a part-time teacher, and she always wanted to pick up writing. And then eventually she, later on in her life, was invited to give lectures on Weston quite a bit, and she also watched through the decades how the story about Weston was changing. And she felt it was really important to write her own autobiography. And that came out when she was in her late 70s or early 80s. And it's called Through Another Lens, My Life with Edward Weston, or My Years with Edward Weston. And that's the passage that I read from there, one of those passages. But I think she wrote that book not only for him, because of her frustration with how he was being framed, but also to speak up for herself as someone who had more agency than she was given by the art world in his images.
So before you started making this work, you had ideas about who Edward was, and I guess in some ways, like by extension, kind of who Charis was, or maybe not, like no sense of who Charis was.
Yeah.
And what is really interesting about this body of work is how you try to rewrite that history and reframe that history. So tell us about how you came to Edward's work and what you knew about Edward, and what was the story about Edward that you kind of received, and then what by extension did that lead you to believe about Charis?
Yeah, so truthfully, in my photo history classes, I didn't learn that much about Weston. It was like a survey class, and I might have seen a couple of nudes that he made in the 1920s that are cropped tight. There's one of Charis in this slideshow that is shown in that way, and of course his famous bell pepper images, and perhaps Charis rolling down the sand dunes. But I don't think I knew her name. Those photographs are titled Nude, 1934, Nude, 1936. And truthfully, I wasn't the biggest Weston fan. And I had learned later, as many people have learned throughout their schooling, about the male gaze. And I was very hesitant to take on a project centered around Edward Weston, to tell you the truth. But when I was at the University of North Texas for my undergrad degree, one of my closest friends, Chaz Bowie, and I used to lay in his apartment on the floor and look at photo books nonstop. He gave me a postcard that had a picture of Charis floating in a pool, and it's in the slideshow here. And I didn't know it was Charis, but I felt a connection to that image. And that was something I held on to for a really long time. I was a swimmer, a competitive swimmer, and I think seeing her float in that pool reminded me of being exhausted after a swim team workout and being able to lay like she was in that pool. And then years later, when I was starting to photograph my own previous partner, Betsy Odom, I began to take portraits of her, and I was very conflicted about the power dynamics of having the photographer have power over their subject. And that came from me thinking about the male gaze. Also, that way of working was pretty foreign to me, even though I'm a portrait photographer. My previous body of work that I'm known for in the art world is called Double Life, and there's 2 images from that series in this slideshow. But those, when you see those in an exhibition, they appear to be 2 women in a relationship, but it's really the same one model photographed in each scene, digitally composited. When I make those images, I have a camera on a tripod, set a self-timer, and I'm in front of the camera with my model. I'm wearing one outfit, she's wearing the other, and we're responding to one another, but there's no one behind the camera. So I take several pictures of us dressed one way, we switch clothes, take several pictures of us dressed another way, and then I erase myself out. So for me to not work that way and to now be behind the lens where I'm looking at someone who has the decision to either look away or meet my gaze was kind of a challenge. And I was photographing with Betsy for this image here in Lakeside, Michigan, and I looked over and she was laying on this sand-colored comforter, and I immediately thought of that picture that Edward had made of Charis rolling down the sand dunes. And I thought, well, maybe there's something there. I'll start doing research on people who have photographed their partners over a long period of time. So I researched Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, Saichi Furuya and his wife Christine Gosler, and then that eventually led me to Charis and Edward. And once I read her text in California in the West, which was published in 1940, I just started to do a deep dive and kind of got obsessed with Charis and spent the next 10 years of my life learning as much about her as I could.
So let's jump into the research a little bit, because that's such an important part of how this body of work came together. And I think you did an unusual amount of research for this. I don't do this much research for exhibitions that I work on most of the time. I would imagine you have to be one of the leading experts on Edward Weston and Charis Wilson at this point, given all of the time you've immersed yourself in it. So, what form did your research take, and where did it take you?
Yeah, so I first wanted to read everything that she had written. She hasn't written so much, so I read California in the West, and then I read her autobiography. I found the camera craft articles that she had read, and then I realized that her archives were housed at the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, along with Edward Weston's archives as well. But I didn't want to look at his archives, I just wanted to look at hers. So I started with her first, and was just kind of blown away by everything she saved. She saved letters to family members, letters to Edward, letters to other models he had photographed, many, many drafts of her own writing, an extensive travel log. There's just all kinds of memorabilia you can sift through. So I took several trips to the center to look at her archives, and at a certain point I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to go through Edward's archives too. So I started to do that as well. But Betsy and I took our first trip to photograph out west in 2014, and when we came back and I saw the film, I realized that there was only so much a photograph could do on its own, and there was no way all this research and knowledge I had gained from the center and from hearing her voice in her writing and also listening to her speak through audio recordings at the center, none of that could be represented in a still image alone. So I realized I was gonna have to write, and I'm not a trained writer. So then I took writing classes, and it completely changed my art practice and my practice as an artist to be able to write this really long text that interweaves their life with the life of me and Betsy 80 years later.
Could you talk a little bit about learning to write and kind of how you developed a practice as a writer? Because they're not, like, being a photographer and being a writer, in my experience, are incredibly different kinds of skills and different ways of being in the world.
Yeah.
Like, one, you're out in the world, you're exploring, you're responding to the world, and others, you're with yourself in a quiet place, you're thinking, you're like, your creativity manifests in a very different way. And so I'm curious, like, how you evolved as an artist, and how did writing really come into that practice?
Yeah, so prior to this, I had written a few art reviews for like Art Lies magazine, which is a Houston-based publication. And I had written a few other short published texts that were just reviews of books or photo books or art exhibitions. So I did enjoy writing, but this called for a much more lengthy text. So once I took that writing class that I mentioned, my writing teacher was really gracious and said that he was willing to meet with me whenever I'd finished chapters to give me feedback. So I just realized that my brain, like many writers, was really sharp in the morning, and I was gonna have to change the way that I worked. So I would wake up, make coffee, try to write at least 20 or 30 minutes a day, and then that was the main goal, just write 20 minutes a day, and eventually it led to something longer. On Saturdays, I was able to write a little bit more. But even now, I'm in a writing group that meets at 7 a.m. and we just say hello over Zoom, turn off our camera, write until 8:15, turn it back on, and just share what we did, not the content. It's like a accountability club for each other. And now, the project I'm working on now, I don't even know if there's gonna be photographs included in it, which is kind of crazy, yeah.
So while we're on the topic of writing, let's talk a little bit more about the book, because it's essentially a travel log, but you're weaving together a number of different stories. You shift kind of between genres. It's part history, it's part memoir. How did you arrive at this structure of the book? And then there's photographs throughout the book as well, obviously. How did you weave all of this together?
Yeah, so it was a challenge. The truth is, Betsy and I took, I think, 6 trips out west. But if you read the text in Pictures for Charis, it reads as one long road trip. So it starts in Chicago, and then every chapter is named a new stop on our trip. So there's like 3 chapters before we even get to California, which is the first place where I intersect with Charis and Edward and the work that they had made. So you're just reading one long trip from Chicago to California and back, with a side trip at the end where I go to Louisiana to make a photograph for Charis based on the Evangeline oak. Charis and Edward also went on a second trip for this publication he was working on called Leaves of Grass, that Walt Whitman wrote all the text for and Edward Weston made all the images for. And Charis was with him as they traveled through the 48 states to make work for that. And she had her own ideas for projects, but that timeline for that trip was much more condensed, and they were really traveling quite a bit. It was also right before the war broke out, but she had asked if he would pull over so that they could visit this tree she had done research about called the Evangeline oak, and he said, no, we don't have time. So they missed that tree. And on top of that, Charis also met someone on that trip who she was really attracted to, and she almost had an affair with this man. So that trip caused kind of a chasm between them, and the writing that I weave in this text is my journey with Betsy to California and back, while also telling their story about their relationship from when they first met and they were super attracted to one another, and it was full of like desire and a lot of just great collaboration and a very close encounters with one another as far as the camera to subject distance that Edward had with Charis, and then it follows their relationship through a comfortable companionship to a working partnership where they're both working on writing and photography, and then it moves on to their later stages of their relationship where it starts to fall apart until Charis leaves Edward in 1946. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was really drawn to Charis. I'm always interested in relationships. My previous work, Double Life, is all about relationships. And I knew what it was like to leave someone who you loved. I got married when I was 22 to a man, and we just got married too young. And I left that marriage at 26, but it was really painful and sad because I saw how much he loved me. And I knew that she really cared for Edward, even though she decided to leave and have her own life after him. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the pictures. So there's kind of, to oversimplify it, there's kind of 2 kinds of pictures in the show. There's the pictures that you made of Betsy, and then there's the pictures that you made around California that are really in dialogue with Edward's work. And the pictures of Betsy are also in dialogue with the pictures that Edward made of Charis. But what did you learn from making those pictures? This is not the first time that you'd photographed a model for an extended period of time, but what did you learn from photographing Betsy?
Yeah, so well, as I mentioned before, I was having this huge conflict, and that started this whole project. I think that by finding Charis and learning from her, I was able to photograph with Betsy and make pictures of Betsy as Betsy, but also Betsy playing Charis, or Betsy playing Edward, or me taking on the role of Edward, or me taking on the role of Charis. Or so we were able, that framework really helped me to think about what kind of work we wanted to make together. And it also allowed a picture like this, which was the first picture I made of Betsy and Marfa. This one was made in Chicago in 2009. So some of those older pictures were able to be used in this project as well before I even thought about making pictures that had to do with Charis or Edward. One thing that did change in my practice technically is I had always photographed with a medium format camera. And these landscape photographs are all 4x5 camera images made with a Toyo 4x5 camera that can fold up really tight and fit in a backpack. And after Betsy and I had driven 3 full days to make it to the San Rafael Reef, I remember taking that camera out to make my first real landscape photograph. And there were all of these tourists at this designated, picturesque turnout where they had selfie sticks and were making selfies. And I'm off in the parking lot trying to make a different image. And I'm underneath this big black t-shirt. I didn't even have a, professional black, cape thing.
Dark cloth?
Yes, dark cloth. I just had my friend's black t-shirt, and I was like, what am I doing? Why am I trying to make pictures that are in reference to Weston and Ansel Adams and all these male modernist photographers that have already been out west? And I kind of had a panic, but then I just decided to keep going. So along with me learning writing, I also had to learn how to use the 4x5. And the story also weaves in some of that, as well as talks about how Betsy and I, as a queer couple out on the road, how that was a different experience than white men who had photographed before us decades before.
So on that note, the way that gender is articulated and expressed in photographs or performed in photographs has been an abiding interest of yours. So how did that play into this body of work? Because you were noticing things in Edward's pictures of Charis and how she was performing different aspects of her gender identity. And then also in the pictures of Betsy, that comes up quite a lot. So tell us about your interest in gender and its relationship to photography.
Yeah, so I've always felt that people should have the freedom to have a more fluid definition of gender. Betsy is really androgynous, and anytime we would travel, especially if we're at an airport or a smaller town, often when we were walking into the women's restroom, people would stop her and say, "This is the women's restroom," or "You need to," they would call her sir. And she would always get really flustered by that. And me witnessing that experience made me think about, why can't someone be feminine and have short hair? Why do we think that men need to look a certain way, or women need to behave or look a certain way based on their gesture or dress? Shouldn't everyone have more of a fluid way of being in the world? And so one way I do that in this work is through titling. So some images are titled Betsy, Lake Ediza. Others are different names. So there's one where it's April 2009, and then Preston, I think that one is 2011. But she was posing as Preston Holder, who Edward Weston had photographed. So she's posing as a more masculine pose there. But I think by titling different genders and using her name, it's allowing her a more fluid identity. And then with Charis, she's typically described as an ideal beauty, but the truth is she was really bohemian, loved wearing men's clothing, cut her hair extremely short for the Guggenheim travels, and the famous photograph that Edward made of her at Lake Ediza shows her hair wrapped in a scarf, so you can't see that. But there's a picture in here coming up made by Ansel Adams that shows her lighting a cigarette, and she's got extremely short hair. She looks like a heartthrob. She's really tomboyish. She's wearing men's clothes and men's boots. So she was very comfortable in her sexuality and was able to be kind of one of the guys on the road. And we don't hear that story about Charis. And then same thing for Edward. At parties they would have, he often liked to cross-dress. He would find someone at the party that was about his height. He was 5'2", actually. And he would wear her dress, whoever's dress that he wanted, and dance with the women as he's wearing dresses. And that's a story we don't hear about Edward, but I think he was much more fluid in his gender presentation. But many male writers wrote about him, so we don't hear that story about Edward as well.
So you touched on this a little bit about the history of Western landscape photography and it mostly being, a history that is kind of charted by male photographers. You spent a lot of time going to places where Charis and Edward lived, where they made pictures. What were you going for with those pictures by revisiting those sites? What were you hoping to get out of going to those places?
Yeah, so for me, it was less about reef photography. There's many photographers who love to make photographs standing in the exact same place where someone once stood. Some of these pictures, I am standing where Edward stood, and I will take the same picture or try to take a similar picture that he took in the same spot. But then other times will turn my camera to the left or right or even behind me. So I was really open to that. It was much more about a psychological or emotional feeling I was after. And then I also wanted to see what pictures I could make that were guided by Charis. So if she had written about a place and talked about the flowers or the animals or the atmosphere or the weather, then I would turn my camera and not make the picture that Edward might have made there, so that I was making a picture more in line with what I had read from her writing. So that was one of the differences with how I make landscape photographs. And I was really open to surprises like this picture here, which was a total surprise. And then this one right here is based exactly on Weston, so is this one. It took us forever to find these juniper trees there. Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe had found those trees and photographed them. They're two well-known photographers, and both of them had sent me two totally different descriptions of where they thought they were based on their memory. So I printed both of them out, and Betsy and I finally found those trees. But that was the one time I felt like I was standing in exactly the same spot that he stood, and it was kind of a thrill and a rush. But for me, it was more about a pilgrimage to spend time with a person, and that person was Charis. Like, I felt like she was right there the whole time.
I think one of the things that's interesting about the way that you photograph the landscape, Edward's pictures are so beautiful and flawless, and the landscape looks untouched. And a lot of the pictures that you made, there's some where it's almost an exact, recreation of that picture, which is fascinating to see in some cases how little the place has changed over the course of 80 years. But there's others where it's so much more rough-hewn the way that you're photographing the landscape. Like you've kind of taken the gloss off of these beautiful places. And so I'm curious, when you were there, what were you seeing that was different? Were you recognizing, oh, this looks like the pictures that I've seen, or were you seeing something that was different in those places?
Edward Weston was an amazing printer. Truthfully, I learned that. The pictures in California and the West, the reproductions aren't good, but once you see those photographs that he's printed in his darkroom that are at the Center for Creative Photography, I became more of a Weston fan by seeing those actual prints very close up. And the blacks are really incredible. They're just pretty phenomenal. But for us, I'm less of a technical geek. honestly, and sometimes our trips were only 10 days on the road, and you really have to improvise and be okay with whatever you get. So I knew, we had one day to photograph at Point Lobos, and whatever picture I made, it was going to have to be okay, and I was going to have to move on. So a lot of that is just allowing things to shift and move, and for me to be okay with things not being perfect. Yeah.
So let's talk about the exhibition a little bit. So it's the way that you wanted to display the work is pretty distinctive. So the show brings together about 40 of Kelli's photographs and 50 of Edward's photographs, along with a whole bunch of archival material that Kelli accumulated. So describe the way that the show is laid out and why you wanted to do it that way. Because no one's ever approached me with this kind of idea before.
Yeah. So my photographs, the landscapes are 40 by 50 inches in scale. The portraits of Betsy are 30 by 40 inches or 20 by 25 inches. So my work is really large. Edward Weston's images are contact prints, so they're either 8 by 10 inch photographs in white mats or 4 by 5 inch photographs in white mats. And I thought it would be really interesting to have his work laid out in vitrines that trace their relationship from the very first picture he made of her through the time that they were together on the Guggenheim travels to when they lived together in Carmel to the last picture he ever made of her, which is this one right here. So I edited his images made during that time frame from 1934 to 1946 based on their relationship, and that's what you see in the vitrines. And then my work is on the wall large. I thought it was really important to have my work on the wall and not Edward's work on the wall, to have him have a more quiet presence so that hopefully her voice would be able to be elevated through the text we included. So in the vitrines and on some of the labels, there's actual text that Charis had written or text that I had written. So you're kind of listening to both of us talk without Edward's written voice there. But I think there's some interesting echoes that can happen when you're looking at his smaller photographs and you see mine on the wall. You can make these connections, and hopefully there's some good conversations that are started by that distance between the work.
I mean, I feel like the whole show, the book, is really an extended conversation, and you've been spending time with Charis and Edward for the last 10 years. And so I'm curious, like, after all that time with them, how do you connect with them? And like, do you feel a certain kind of kinship with either or both of them? And kind of like, how do you identify with either of them, having spent all this time with them?
So with Charis, it's crazy that someone would spend 10 years of their life researching and trying to get so close to someone who's no longer here. That you've only seen through images. What a crazy thing I did to do that about this woman that I'll never meet. And so Arno Raphael Minkinen, another photographer who I really admire, told me that many people take pilgrimages so that they can feel close to someone and to know what their life might have been like by taking a pilgrimage. And I really felt like that with her. I felt like she was right there. And the truth is, when I drove back to Chicago on that very last trip and saw the Chicago skyline and then Lake Michigan spread out, I was just really emotional that was the end of my time with her. And then just about a month ago, her daughter, Rachel, emailed me and said, can we have a phone call? And I was like really nervous because I had no idea what she would think about the book. And we talked on the phone for like 2 hours, and she said that Charis would have really loved to meet me, and she felt like we were kindred spirits, and she said that Charis would have really just been so amazed that I drove all that way to photograph at the Evangeline Oak, even though there was a huge flood that really happened and I couldn't even get the picture that I wanted. And then we just talked for such a long time about her life, and she said she was really glad that she didn't talk with me while I was writing the book, that I got to talk to Rachel afterwards. But I'm really grateful for Charis also because she helped me to see Edward differently. I wasn't a fan of Weston, and I was kind of not angry at the white male modernists, but I was definitely on that side of things. But what she made me realize is all of us will become the stories that people tell about us after we pass away. And those stories are always going to reduce or simplify or never be able to tell what it was really like to be in the presence of someone who we're close to. And then she also made me realize that however we learn about Weston or any other historical figure, we're learning about them through writing, reading someone else's writing or research. So who were those people? Back in the 1930s, 40s, all those decades, the early decades leading up to that, the people that wrote about Weston were white male writers. So many of them wrote through their own lens and their own experience, and they loved telling certain stories about Weston. But I wonder what history would have been told about him if women were allowed to write and have their voices heard. What would Martha Graham say about Weston, or other dancers that he photographed, if their voices were telling history, or his queer friends, his best friend Ramiel McGehee, or Minor White, if they wrote a history that included Weston, we might think about them differently. So it made me think about who gets to tell history and how is it told. And I think that was one of the main motivations in this book, to uncover her, but for hopefully readers to start thinking about that and to try to uncover untold stories in our history of photography.
I think that's a good spot to end it on, and we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Thanks, Kelli.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right, so you've all submitted a whole bunch of questions already, so thank you. Give me a second just to take a look at these. Okay, so this is a good one. This is something we didn't touch on yet. So Anonymous said, I enjoyed your video daybook in reference to Weston's own daybooks. How did you decide to film instead of write? What was the filming process like, considering the scope of the whole project?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, I didn't talk about the video at all. So when I was on sabbatical in 2013 and then again in 2016, I decided to make a 1-minute photograph every day of that sabbatical time. I think because I just thought it would hold myself accountable to making art. And I'm not someone who likes to be in front of the camera, but I got very used to those videos daily. Like, I just got used to doing them. I completely would kind of forget that the camera was on, and I was just recording my process as an artist. And I didn't know what I was going to do with those. In my head, I just thought maybe when I was 80, I was going to make the world's longest slow film that shows an artist like making work. But the benefit of those is once I had written this book and we were talking about the exhibition, I was like, oh, I have all this footage that shows me struggling at the beginning, not knowing what the heck I'm doing at an artist residency, looking at pictures of Betsy before I'd even done any research at the CCP. And so all that footage was there, and I could edit it to create a video that would show my working process from the beginning struggles through me learning the 4x5 to photographing with Betsy. You get to see her play the banjo, and us, I broke my ground glass at Lake Tenaya, and you see Betsy, after we went to Home Depot, sanding the ground glass, a piece of plexiglass that I could use as a new ground glass. So all of that's kind of in that video. And then I thought it was really important because you see Betsy and Charis, and then we know what Edward looks like, we know him. I thought it might be interesting to also show me there as well, even though I felt uncomfortable with that.
So I should also say that in addition to the video that Kelli made, our in-house videographer, Carly Howard, also made a fantastic video that's about Kelli and Kelli's work that you can watch on the High's website. So if you go to the exhibition page, it's about a 10-minute long video, and it's really fantastic to see Kelli out in the field working, and she's in the archive at CCP. So it's a real behind-the-scenes look at how an artist creates a body of work. Here's another question from Anonymous. Is it, how would you say the queer lens differs from the heterosexual gaze?
Yeah, that's a good question. That question I'm still conflicted by, to tell you the truth. I think about that all the time. Like, can we tell if a man is making a picture of someone or a woman? Is there a difference? Definitely in how, I guess the care that's taken in thinking about how viewers are going to respond or interpret work might be there, but also in gesture, clothing, body language, what you're trying to say that might be political or personal that comes up with the queer experience that's photographed. That's definitely true and different. But the root of that is what started the conflict that I had. And I feel like through this project, I've kind of freed myself from feeling so stuck with that question. But yeah, I still really enjoy thinking about the puzzle of that question and the puzzle of portraiture in general. Like, what do we really learn about a person when we're looking at a picture of them? Do we get to know them at all? And I think that's why I'm drawn to portrait projects that photograph someone over a very long period of time. But even with Double Life, you don't really know who Kiba is. She's playing a role. And then Betsy, how I see her in real life isn't how I see her in my photographs. It's very strange. There's something else that happens with photography there.
So this is a good follow-up question. So this is another question from another anonymous person. Y'all are really shy. Did your work on this project change the way you viewed intimacy between photographers and their models, regardless of gender?
I don't know if it changed the way I thought about it. I think it definitely let me be more empathetic towards Weston, I guess, because I realized that many of those women, the early portraits he had made of several women in his studio that are very cropped and don't show their faces, many of those women were dancers or working in theater, but they would lose their jobs if their faces were shown. So they also may have wanted to remain anonymous, and those early photographs were also pretty avant-garde and went against the grain of pictures we had seen previously as part of pictorialism that shows usually women in white gowns, highlighting that they're mothers with children and in more traditional roles. So that changing the body to be more formal or to show movement was really out of the box, and I don't think it's always framed that way. So I think me thinking about how he photographed them, thinking of form, like they were much more about sensuality, not so much about sex, I guess, or at least in my mind, now that I've spent so much time with those. I know many people might disagree on those images in particular, those early ones, and those are pre-Charis. So that's the other thing with the story of their life. His last daybook entry mentions Charis, but then their life begins where that last entry is beyond that. And I think Edward had actually grown and changed to be a new person, like we all change and evolve and grow throughout our lives. Like he was a different person than the person he was in his early 20s that captures the daybook entries. And we don't really know what his writings about his own life would be because he was busy living life, making new landscapes, and living a life with her afterwards.
We have time for one more, but there's one that's really quick. So Johnny asked about, it says the subtitles say Charis with a K. That's just the transcription software not knowing how to spell her name for the sake of clarity. Okay, so for the last question, this comes from Maria. That says, since writing is so integral to this project, can you speak to the role the exhibition plays since visitors may not read or engage with the text alongside the photographs to the same extent as the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was a good challenge, actually, too. It was a huge challenge for me to figure out how the text and images were going to work in this book. But then also I realized with the exhibition, people won't quite understand the long story that I've talked about tonight without reading text. And I think that you could still figure out that this work is emotional and melancholic, maybe tied a little bit towards grief and love and about relationships, whether you read the text or not. And you can get that by looking at their relationship laid out in a timeline based on the first image he made to the last, and then hopefully feel that tone or learn about me and Betsy through the way I photograph her on those trips with no words attached.
All right, so that's all the time we have. The exhibition, again, is on view until January 5th, and we actually have copies of the book for sale out in the lobby, right? We still have them out there? And they are all already signed by Kelli, but if you would like her to personalize them, she can hang out for a little bit longer to do that. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Kelli, for talking about the work.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.